Hi, watching Morning Live. Thanks so much for joining us. Now, we're talking privatisation, to privatise or not. And economist Lumkile Mondi holds the view that privatisation of state-owned enterprises will give some relief from the current financial burden that the country currently finds itself in. However, he also argues that although privatisation can help grow the economy, it is not possible under the current climate, namely that of a failing rule of law and lack of accountability. And on the other hand, political analyst Khaya Sithole says that privatisation of, for example, SAA could lead to some job losses, but that doing nothing could be worse. So Khaya Sithole is with us here in studio while Lumkile Mondi joins us on the line. Gentlemen, thanks so much for your time this morning.
Thank you. Thank you
so much. I'm sorry, Kara, I'm not in the studio.
Not a problem. We can hear you loud and clear, Lumkile. And let me start with you because I want both of you to put your arguments on the table. Why do you think, Lumkile, from all the avenues that we could possibly pursue, we should go the privatization route when it comes to state-owned enterprises?
The South African government owns about 41% of the South African economy. The South African government is running a huge debt-to-GDP ratios at the moment. We have challenges across many areas of our economy. We saw yesterday the South African Reserve Bank increase interest rate. So the majority of South Africans are not coping to live because of high costs coming from whether the VAT increases that we saw earlier this year, the continuing increases of food and other goods. So therefore, I think the only way for us to relieve the state is through selling some of its assets so that we can be able to improve the financial position of South Africa.
Khaya, is that the way to go?
I do think that the bigger issue here is what exactly is it that we want the state to play as a role in the economy. So, of course, there are some very, very convincing arguments why the state has to have a role in some economic sectors, particularly if you look at a situation like Eskom. Absolutely no private player would ever have the capacity to run an institution of that nature. The key problem that we're facing here is that the reason we ended up with the conversation of privatization being so amplified in society is simply because the state-owned enterprises in their current form are not performing. But my argument is that it's not privatization that we seek, but profitability of these state-owned enterprises, because if they were profitable, we wouldn't have this problem. The question that has to be asked then is, can we reach that profitability without some form of private sector intervention? And what form of intervention do we need? Do we want outright shareholding to be in the private hands, or do we simply want to have a model that says the private sector has mastered the art of running businesses? So even though the state might stay as a shareholder, you must really have a private sector mindset in running the business, rather than simply selling off the family jewels, because we happen to be at a stage right now where we obviously have a high debt-to-GDP ratio. So we really have to think about the long term rather than just saying that selling off one asset now is suddenly going to reduce the debt that you have, so therefore it's good to go. There must be longer term considerations at play.
So let me ask you the question. Do you believe that it is possible to turn around the fate of these state-owned enterprises and render them profitable?
Yeah, I mean, the key issue here is that the reason these enterprises were created in the first place is that there is an economic reason why they should exist. The problem here is that we have to remember that state-owned enterprises have to balance the economic profit motive but also the social mandate that they fulfill. So, for example, if Eskom was a private sector player and had the latitude to increase and hike prices as it wishes, a lot of people wouldn't be able to afford electricity. But then you remember that in instances where perhaps people do not have any income, then there is a basic electricity grant that they get allocated. And you have the same situation with water, where some kiloliters will be given to families that can't afford them. The private sector doesn't have a strong track record in giving things away for free on the basis that the social mandate has to be fulfilled. So I'd be loath to think that a country that has such deep, poverty issues can essentially say that everything should be in the private sector hands, because private sector hands legitimately chases profit motive first and foremost. And at some point in time, they will put up their hands and say, well, actually, we're not going to give anything away. We're not going to participate in the whole social consensus. We're just chasing our profits. And that will leave us all worse off as a country.
Now, Lumkile, to you, you may respond to what Khaya has said in your response, but also if you could just respond to this. So you're saying that you look at these so-called black holes that some of our state-owned enterprises have become. But why have they become that? Is it not because of poor corporate governance as one reason for that? But also, what are the political underpinnings of privatization? Who stands to benefit, and should we be looking that way?
Well, in fact, let me say this, that Khaya and I don't disagree, because Khaya is saying basically it is the capital structure of the company. So in privatization, there's different models that one can apply. And I think, if I understand him correctly, what Khaya is saying is basically maybe bringing an equity partner into co-ownership of a business such as Eskom may yield some positive results. Which is what I'm saying, really, that, when you privatize the different forms, it's a complete sell-out, or you can have joint ventures, or you can have equity minorities by government in those entities. So I'm happy that he agrees with that. In the South African case, it's a capability issue and malfeasance. We know that the past 10 years has really been about accumulation by private individuals linked to the ANC. And so really they were destroyed with a purpose. The purpose to make sure that those that have got political influence could secure contracts through procurement and other forms. So to clean them up, given the weaknesses of our balance sheet, given the fact that the consumer is also stretched, is unable to service some of these tariffs that have been going up, we need to think innovatively. So for me, really, it's not an ideological debate. It's a practical debate about what do we do when you're in financial distress, as we are as consumers as well as government.
So your point is valid, but how do you reignite and stimulate this economy without political reform? Because if there's no political reform, if our politicians don't change the way in which they operate, and especially in relation to the state, then surely we are basically on a hiding to none. Nothing is going to change in the long run. Would you agree with that?
I agree with that, and I'm looking forward to the consumer in 2019 May exercising his or her choice to make sure that you get a government that can respond to the needs of the people, the needs of the economy.
And if we look at what's happened in Asia, for example, Khaya, if you take China as an example and how China has managed to get their economy to where it is right now, and basically through state-guided economic reforms, why can't we follow that route?
We can. We just don't have the right government for it, because really what you want here is you want to put people in place that have primarily the skills of running a business and say to them, look, we are giving you latitude to transform this thing into an economic powerhouse. We are giving you the political guidance on how we want it to be done, and then let people who are good at running businesses do so. Unfortunately, in South Africa, that is not the first thing that we ask for when you're looking for somebody to run a state-owned enterprise. The first thing that we ask for is political affiliation, political ideology, and then we look into executive skills. And unfortunately, that model has proved to be thoroughly fallacious. It's proved to be fatal. And right now, the question should be, how do we move away from that? Because the reality here is that if you have politicians who get appointed to a board of a particular enterprise on the basis that they've got a political affiliation, rather than the ability to understand how to govern that structure properly and how to guide it properly, you do see problems. There have been some highlights. And I think when you look at the SAA example, for instance, when Cheryl Carolus was there and she was part of the board, it was really stuffed with people whose private sector skills, whose private sector expertise was able to deliver a particular strategy that they then tabled. Unfortunately, the then Minister Malusi Gigaba simply ejected all of them, and SAA was then set back by another 5 to 10 years. The question is, how do we stop this form of interference where politicians who quite simply do not have a clue about how to turn around a business or anything else for that matter can then be kept away from organizations that are so critical to the lifeblood of the South African economy that they need to be preserved?
Well, the unfortunate reality is that these politicians are there. They are part and parcel of the deal. But what about the developmental imperative of this developmental state? How do you privatize state-owned enterprises when the government itself is one of the major employers and therefore the providers of employment in the state, amongst other things, Lumkile Mondi?
Well, as we have been discussing, it's quite clear to us that the concept of a developmental state is a theoretical one. Developmental states, by definition, they're capable of meeting basic needs of our people, of ensuring that the cost of doing business in the country are low for business to thrive, but at the same time, they're able to guide and use their stick to ensure that private sector is aligned to the broader national agenda. And our South African government is not that. It's a government that is more concerned about the hegemony within the governing political party. And in fact, the political party comes first, the South Africa second, the economy last, and therefore we need to really look at the political machinery and see whether it's possible for us to have a government of the people that's accountable, that puts South Africa's interests at heart than a political party at heart.
But that does not change the fact that we are a developmental state. And how do we then, so how does it change that? How does the politics of the day and the inclinations of the political elite change who we are as a state?
Is it me or Khaya?
It's you, Lumkile.
Yes, so, I mean, the critical area that you need to do, I mean, Khaya has been involved in this, is around education. Just ensuring that, we fix the education sector. By fixing the education sector, we then, particularly the areas around the TVETs, where instead of really focusing more on academics, we also focus on skills formation. But that has to be linked with the private sector so that the private sector is aligned to the education and training, because the apprenticeship has to take place within private sector companies. And by doing that, we'll be able to change the trajectory and ensure that the skill set that we produced at TVETs and varsities is aligned to the business needs and therefore to the economy of our country, and we can develop our country and move forward.
Do you agree, Khaya? Are we a developmental state or aren't we?
I think the key thing about the whole concept of a developmental state is that it's not supposed to be a permanent equilibrium. So if we are going to assess ourselves and say we are a developmental state, the question should then be, how do we migrate away from that onto something far more ambitious? Because what we tend to do is that we conflate the concept of a developmental state with then saying that, the government must always be perpetually involved. I mean, one of the questions that I always ask people is, when we say we've got 17 million people on social grants, shouldn't we have a roadmap to say we're going to move from 17 million to zero? And
Fair
simply
point.
ask the question of how people get to that stage.
But right now, on the 23rd of November 2018, are we a developmental state or not?
Yes, we are.
So with that, obviously, comes certain responsibilities towards the state.
Yeah, and that's the whole concept of me saying that you can't go for outright privatization, because unfortunately privatization follows a capitalist model which simply says that we're going to generate maximum profits. And unfortunately, one consequence of that is that, for example, if you said SAA must now go into private hands, all you end up with as the state is just the tax that you might extract out of it. Whatever dividends might accrue to SAA later on will then remain in private hands. So what you want to do is to simply say all these enterprises must be as profitable as they can when they're still in the hands of the state, so that the state essentially has access to all the profits that accrue. But in the private sector, you only have the residual interest, which is just the net income after tax multiplied by the tax rate, which means that your ability to extract some of it is severely diminished. And that, for me, is the big issue.
And Lumkile Mondi, there is, of course, a school of thought that believes that our transition from the RDP, the Reconstruction and Development Program, to GEAR was too soon. And if we're talking privatization at this stage, do we not run the risk of repeating some of the mistakes we've already been making?
In fact, I just want to disagree with Khaya that I don't think we're at a developmental stage. Why in a post-terminal stage? Because you get into position due to your political loyalty to the governing party. We know very, very well that SABC, for example, was run by somebody who was not capable and competent because of his political links with the president then. And that goes across all the state institutions that we've been talking about. So the developmental state concept of Africa today, I don't agree at all. We have a near post-terminal stage. So going forward, in terms of policy choices, it's very important for us to look at where we are today. We've got a very weak state. We've got a very weak balance sheet. We've got an economy that's growing at 0.7%. We've got 27.5% unemployment. We are in almost the same position as we were before 1994. We need a complete restructuring of the economy. We've got no time to be dilly-dallying about ideology. We need to fix this economy. And how to do it? We privatize some of the state assets, we cut the size of government, and we ensure that we are leaner, meaner, and we come with policies that will support the growth of the private sector and create jobs, particularly in manufacturing as well as the tourism sector.
Well, I have to unfortunately leave it there, but thanks to both our guests, Khaya Sithole and Lumkile Mondi, for chatting to us about some of South Africa's economic options and whether we should privatize some of our state-owned enterprises or not. And let us know what your views are as well at Morning Live SABC. That's how you can get in touch with us via Twitter. And we'll take those comments, but we'll do that somewhere later on in the show. But for now, we're going to take news with Leanne Manus.